Welcome everybody. It's amazing to have this special episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors here in the International Facilitation Week. This is an event organized, hosted by the International Association of Facilitators. And guess what? We have 3 members here in this call. It's great that you are taking time to watch us on a Sunday, even though we are recording these on a Friday. But it's terrific that you can take your time to watch this episode, and I'm obviously here to answer all your comments as you watch us now. With me today, my co-host, Martin Duffy. Martin, good to see you here.
Afternoon, everybody. Yeah, good to see you again, Paul. How are you?
And it's good to have you on board. Also as guests to known facilitators, I have members, Sue Bird, from Europe, working in Brussels, and chair of IF chapter. Hi, Sue.
Yep. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you are.
Absolutely. That's the spirit. And from the North America, we have Michael Randel, a dear friend, also IF member, CPF. Michael, good to have you on.
It's nice to be here. Thank you. And I'll just round it out by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening from around the world.
Absolutely. Well said, absolutely. And Martin, over to you. We normally start with a kind of question, right?
Yeah, we normally try to open up with just asking our honored guests if there's anything in particular about yourself that people generally might not be familiar with, but might give people an opportunity to get to know you a little bit more deeply than would be the normal case in a group discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can go first if you like, Michael. I don't mind doing that. Yeah.
Please.
Well, perhaps a lesser known something about me, because it's not on my CV or LinkedIn profile, I don't think it is at least, is that I'm quite a football fan. And I'm very interested recently in the Women's World Cup as well as the men's, following the men's tournaments. And I even went to Qatar last year to follow England, because I live and work in Brussels in Belgium, and I've in fact got Belgian nationality, but I've also got UK nationality, which are my origins. So you always go back to your origins, and England has to be the team for me.
Super. Yeah, really interesting. Wow. Michael?
Well, yes, it's talking about origins. So people assume that because I live in Washington, D.C., I must be American. My accent then tends to confuse them.
Yeah.
And so I had a kind of a global childhood, lived in a number of different countries growing up.
Super.
But pertinent for today and origins, born in Ireland and lived there for a number of years with my Irish family. And we also lived in South Africa for a number of years, and I sort of grew up in South Africa, did my schooling and early career there. And what's pertinent right now is the Rugby World Cup is going on. There are 2 teams that wear green, Ireland and South Africa. And if we really are true about it, I'm rooting for Ireland. They've got a fantastic team this year. South Africa's had time being world champions. They've done it enough. Let's go Ireland.
Okay, cool.
Very good. Yeah, super. It's well, I suppose actually it was interesting in our last discussion, that very question segued us into the substantive content of our actual discussion with our previous 2 guests. But our maybe we can segue, Michael, from your comment there about measuring performance, and in a World Cup competition, you know, is the measure of performance really about who raises the cup, or is there some other way that we can measure performance? And then if we translate that into our teams around us, which is really the subject matter that we thought yourself and Sue might be able to make a significant contribution on. What do we measure? How do we measure? Do we know that what we're measuring is of any benefit to anybody? There's 100 questions we could probably start with, but I'll just open the floor to both of you for your initial ideas or thoughts on measuring our team performances?
It's a great question. Sue, I'm curious, with your experience working in the European Commission and places like that, lots of teams set up for all sorts of reasons. What did you see? What have you learned about assessing the performance and productivity of teams?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think, it's an issue which is always behind anything that any public organization does, or indeed the private sector, because time as a resource is more and more valuable these days. So efficient use of time in whatever that way that may mean in terms of productivity related to results of a meeting, actionable points, the extent to which actionable points are then taken up subsequently, monitored and reviewed. I think those, quite obvious ones really, but key metrics that I'd be looking to ensure that we do. We measure for a reason, and we measure because we want to monitor progress over time, and we want to improve over time in whatever meeting space we're working and whatever subjects we're working with, some of which will be more complex than others. Some will be short term, some will be medium term, some will be longer term. So yeah, a look at actionable points. My starting point, look at actionable points, and then look at how the implementation of those points is looking over time through good monitoring processes.
What you're saying makes me think about the kind of maybe the formal measures that might be in place, and then the informal measures that often are the ones that count. Right. So I worked for some years with an international financial institution, and its business was making loans to countries to support economic and social development. And it was really interesting because the success of the team was measured in how long did it take them to get from the concept to board approval of the loan. Right. And then that was the point of celebration and success. The team leader had done a great job by getting the loan approved. The champagne, corks were popping, everybody was celebrated. The team leader went on to their promotion and moving forward. And then, simply left behind was the question of implementation, which got often passed down to a more junior person to now be the team leader. And it could be several years before that project would be finally fully implemented. And obviously takes a bit longer to be able to really assess the impact. So you could look at what are all the formal marks along the way of success and progress and productivity. But I think there's often a sort of an underculture which really focuses on what matters in this culture. And in that institution, what mattered seemed to be getting loans approved rather than the successful implementation of those loans and the development impact it would make in countries and the impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, you might ask yourself, well, why visibly was the emphasis so much on getting the loan approved, as opposed to what you might think is the more important part, which is actually getting the money out to the beneficiaries, enabling, and making sure then the beneficiaries implement over a period of time. Organizations are quite self-driven and have to be seen to be effective, particularly public sector organizations, because of the public funding, the accountability of the public funding involved. So I wonder in that case if this institution was actually rather mindful of its own status. And clearly, if you can visibly say you've approved X number of loans over an X timescale, amounting to X, A, B amount of funding, for X number of projects, you know, that's really clear achievements as far as the institution is concerned.
Right.
And I suppose it depends then the extent to which you are examined both publicly and privately as to the quality of the implementation of those projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have thought, you know, over time that the latter point would ultimately have been more important in terms of accountability than, which I presume, well, the institution would have been accountable, you know, than more important, the implementation side than the actual setting up of the loan and approval of the loan in the first place. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting from both of your comments. Two things are jumping into my mind from what you've said so far. One is timescale over which we choose to measure, and the second is performance versus productivity. So maybe if we dealt with the performance versus productivity piece initially, and we might just loop back to the timescale question, because I think they might be related to each other. But that idea of performance versus productivity and measuring, like the classic euphemism that a lot of organizations would use: if you don't measure it, it never got done. But would you subscribe to that view of the world when we come to performance measurement versus productivity output measurement? What would your thoughts be on that?
Well, I was, you know, just thinking as you were saying that, Martin. Frederick Taylor came to mind. You know, the sort of time studies expert from 1900, walking around a factory with a stopwatch and a clipboard, and, you know, like really tracking each person and how long did they take and how long could they do it, how could they do it faster, and really focusing on efficiency. He was in factories. We got very concrete, very tangible widgets, let's just say, being assembled, produced. And so there's and I think there the time scale is much shorter. Maybe you're looking at days or even hours, right? So there's a very tangible way of counting productivity and how to increase efficiency to make that happen. With the financial institution that I was working in, gosh, sometimes 2-3 years to get the loan approved, and then maybe start to be implemented, right? So if you think of somebody's career, you know, like I'm in this team, I'm the team leader perhaps. I don't want to wait 10 years to be assessed to whether or not I've been productive and made a difference. You know, so I think what people tend to do is they look for proxy indicators, right? Which is unfortunately then gets us into this trap that where busyness and activity gets counted as being a measure of team performance, rather than, you know, this of the higher order questions, which are more complex, they're more entangled. There's many more things that contribute to whether or not that's going to happen. So it's less easy to say, you know, this impact was achieved by that very effective team. So people want to shorten the timescales. They want to focus on what's concrete and measurable. And those are not always the key elements in the eventual success and impact of a team.
Yeah, that's interesting, Michael, because you're very much focusing there on the, I think, on the operational side, operations, as opposed to, you know, some of the conceptual stuff which might go on behind. And, you know, Martin's question was about performance and productivity, and I would lean towards the performance side in my own concept of maybe what, you know, you think to yourself, well, what is most valuable at the end of the day? And there's all sorts of contributions to value, but we should not forget the value of the softer contributions to discussions, to operational processes, you know, the thinking that goes on behind the strategizing. The mission has to be linked to a mission of a particular unit or a department, or you know, in a big institution, or where I'm used to what we used to call a directorate general. And you know, you maybe have particular teams or particular individuals within particular teams who have a very well-founded conceptual approach, in the sense that you have people there of varying ages who come in with really good ideas. And you know, looking at performance of a team over time, you know, again, and measuring performance, then one should be able to see, and it's more, this is far more difficult to measure, but one should be able to see great ideas, you know, so long as they're not so fantastic ideas that they're sort of outside the culture, you know, it's not acceptable to the culture of the organization, or they're not realistic in terms of being implementable. But assuming those points are present, then you probably will see some evidence of implementation of those ideas, in the sense of them appearing in strategy documents and then being translated into objectives and then being translated into operational projects. You know, that's how I see things having come together over quite a long time scale there. But measuring that in terms of productivity would be quite difficult. But measuring it, or monitoring it and evaluating it and reviewing it in terms of performance might be the way to go with that.
Yeah, and that poses an interesting dilemma. Michael, you touched on there on this idea of quantification. There's a piece of research that I did myself ways back, where I worked with a team for a day, and having reviewed the transcript of the conversations, I did a kind of a quantitative assessment of who contributed most during the meeting. But then I looked at it from a completely different point of view, and I looked at it to say, who had the most profound impact on the direction or the content or the outcome of the day's proceedings? And actually, it turned out that quantitatively, the person who contributed least seemed to have the most profound impact on the team or the group's actual, let's say, strategic plan output, because it was a strategic planning session. I found that remarkable, because if you were the fly on the wall, which I partly was, although I was the facilitator, when you observe, you kind of go, that person was very passive, they were very quiet. But afterwards, when you reflected, which I was now doing in an academic sense, when I reflected on the transcript, I discovered, by accident and by partly design, the person contributing least quantitatively was contributing most qualitatively.
Right.
So could I ask
but
you,
Martin, that brings something up for me. I don't know if you're familiar with the acronym of HIPPO, which is the highest paid person's opinion. Right? And
like
this may or may not have been the case in that room, but often, no matter the quality of the ideas or the quantity of contributions, in many places, because of hierarchy, power, dynamics, et cetera, the ultimate decision comes down to, well, what's the highest paid person's view about this? Often that's the leader or the director, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And of course, healthy teams don't fall into that trap. Leader is actually able to be an enabler and a facilitator of the team. They might speak last and say just one thing, but versus they create the container within which the team does its work, and they seek out and invite diverse views, and they take care with how they put their own ideas forward, so they don't end up squashing discussion and things like that.
Yeah, Michael, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that brings the whole nature of facilitation in, because, you know, a common understanding of facilitation is that we as facilitators work in a participatory, inclusive, bottom-up process. And, you know, some of the processes that I've worked in, I actively encourage I'm sure this is quite common, you know, it's not unknown, this, but I actively encourage the leaders, the managers, for the facilitation to actually see themselves as completely equal with, you know, the people they would normally lead. And that, you know, that creates different dynamics. And I think generally speaking, that's quite well accepted by other participants in the meeting as well, while bearing in mind that that particular person will probably step out at the beginning of the meeting to head things off, and then the facilitated session, and then at the end, stand up to make some closing remarks as well. So, should we say, Martin was referring to individuals who maybe stand out, but not necessarily because they're vocal. I would say, yes, individuals, but yes, equally group processes, because I'm very much a believer that one may have what we may think are brilliant ideas. Wow, gosh, what a light, suddenly a light appears in your head and you've got that really good idea. But obviously, or honestly, those ideas are going to be refined, built upon, expanded, stuff taken away when you actually debate it with other people. And the key to the best performance of teams, I think, is being able to honestly and openly and in a trusting way, share these views that everybody will have and their knowledge and experience to be able to come up with the best solution that a team can come up with. And there you put in place the benchmark, the basis for great performance, and potentially the ability to properly and well monitor implementation as you go forward.
Yeah, and that actually, those 2 points that both of you have made, actually, maybe that's an appropriate time to loop us back to that second question that I posed, which is this idea of the time scale over which we choose to measure performance and or productivity. That if we measure over a week, a month, a quarter, a half year, a year, a 3-year strategic cycle, are we measuring really fundamentally different things? And that's then going to beg the question, which we might come to a little bit later. So how do we go about effectively measuring these different elements within the teams that we lead? So the first question is that time scale point, very short term versus very long term, or something in between. Any thoughts on that? What's appropriate to measure, how to go about measuring?
I've got a picture in mind, a vision in mind of trying to visibly and graphically, photographically, if you like, present what you're suggesting, Martin. And that is the longer the term we're looking at, the greater the eyes are going to look up. So in other words, to look at the sky, look at the clouds, maybe planes flying across the sky. And the shorter the term we're looking at in terms of measuring performance or productivity of initiatives of individual organizations, private sector, public sector, institutions, whatever. We maybe think about life. We maybe think about people moving, traveling on our Earth. So the sort of typically blue sky stuff, blue sky thinking or whatever, that's the highest level thinking, and be up in stratosphere somewhere. And then the conceptual and strategic stuff, which is being worked on to come up with concrete proposals later down the line, but a longer term process would be, aeroplanes in the sky, and then the implementation, the operational side, the everyday, the concrete tasks that we all perform from 1 hour, 1 day to the next, are all of us living our lives and moving around and interacting actually on the earth where we are now. That's sort of my view.
The visual, yeah. No, I can see the picture you're conjuring up in the mind's eye there, Sue, for sure. Michael, thoughts on that?
Yeah. So here's me try and get this into a phrase. Measuring systems are inherently rational and linear and additive. Life, reality, teamwork, project work is neither rational nor linear, and often not additive.
Yeah.
Right. So let's just imagine, you know, the result a group is working towards, this sort of their deliverable is a new policy, right, to be adopted and implemented by the organization. On one hand, there's a sort of a linear timescale that talks about assemble the team, consultations, public meetings, drafting documents, reviews, adoption, implementation. And there's a sort of a idealized timeline that gets created. But then if you look underneath the surface, how is the team actually doing that? They're not probably going in a straight line. They're sort of zigzagging all over the place. They might have to be taking steps back. They might be catapulted forward. So that's, I think, part of the challenge of trying to say the team's productivity or performance is measured that by month 6, they had completed 6 stakeholder consultations. You know, often you've maybe done 2, but the other 4 happen in the next month. You know, so it becomes a bit of a fake measure. Both teams, you know, one that might follow more of a simpler, maybe more linear process, both teams could get to the same result, but they could have followed very different ways to get there.
Yeah.
And I would even hazard that the team that had the more complex path that kind of got reset a couple of times as they got new perspective and new awareness might actually have a higher quality result because they were not just following a timeline and checking boxes as they went along.
I'm reminded, actually, Michael, of when I used to work for a public organization, and I was just making the transition to the private sector. In fact, I retired, in inverted commas, from the public organization, but I've set myself up as a consultant in between times. And talking to an ex-colleague who'd done the same thing, he very interestingly said, look, you know, where we used to work, the processes were very linear, and the relationships were quite linear. Let me say to you, let me warn you, then in the private sector, that's a bit different. You know, so he was clearly sort of comparing and contrasting public sector with private sector, and that I can't remember what word he actually used, but it was non-linear in the sort of way that you're talking about, Michael. And I do agree, you know, that in the longer, and it's possibly longer term, and this is why, you know, if you put yourself in a bit of a straitjacket and say, yeah, we're going to deliver ABC within XYZ timetable, and it's not carefully chosen, it proves to be unrealistic, then you know, even failure is on the cards. So it behoves to think very clearly, logically, and even conceptually about the way you monitor and what you monitor over time. And I completely agree that, you know, these more complex, non-linear processes are often richer in terms of outcomes and implementation than if one is too fixed on, you know, the aims and objectives and measurable KPIs that you've set up along the way.
So does that effectively mean that if we take a strategy for any organization, let's say we take a 2-year or a 3-year strategy, that at the end of 3 years, we can measure the team. So whether it's a small team or a big team, we can measure the team's performance notionally by saying, yes, we delivered on the strategy, or no, we didn't. But along the way, we have these week, month, quarterly, monthly, we have these punctuation, and the way in which we measure at these punctuation points necessarily has to be fundamentally different to the way that we're going to measure at the end of a bigger chunk of work. Is that a fair point? And if that is a fair point, how do we differentiate one time frame measurement from the next bigger time frame measurement?
Yeah, I think there's a difference maybe between quantity and quality. And I think, you know, you can, I mean, quantifying is relatively easy, you know, because we distill it down to details. But when you talk about quality, there we're linking into performance again. And I can't help thinking that you know, we always need a narrative. So attached to any implementation schedule, results-oriented activity with milestones, you know, against specific targets or KPIs that you set up in advance. Okay, you know, there's a certain rhythm to that over time, and you know, perhaps some plan Bs here and there, and times when, you know, there can be alterations to the time scale at particular review points or something like that. But I always think, you know, and possibly the most important point, and perhaps the most interesting part, is the narrative, because there you accompanying your implementation, you know, your results and what you've managed to achieve in quantitative terms, you're letting your public know that actually within that process we encountered this, we encountered that, we built on this because it was a particular success, or we had this problem, so we tackled it and then we stepped beyond it, and this is what we did. And then in terms of your results at the end of the day, the anecdotes and the stories that come out are equally as important in my view, as the facts, as the facts and figures, in particular the figures, you know, the measurement that we're talking about. Now, go back to Michael's original point about the financial institution and them wanting to focus on a particular aspect of their activity. You know, when you get to the stage where you have implemented and you've got a stream of data alongside some stories and anecdotes and analysis, you know, narrative analysis, which is going to be most important to the public to communicate? Well, the media love, you know, facts and figures, don't they? Figures and particularly stark facts as well. The narrative, the explanation, the complexities, you know, which requires a bit more reading, a bit more, you know, has to be digested perhaps over time, is not always as easy. But I would argue, you know, as important, if not more important, than your linear quantified stuff.
Yeah, and actually I've got a story that is in my mind that really brings these dynamics out. So I want to talk about basically a team that existed for 3 weeks and delivered on its mission, its product, its purpose. So I was a member of this team. It was a 4-member team doing a midterm evaluation of an environmental project in Southeast Asia, which was being funded by a European government. And the idea of a midterm evaluation is it's formative, right? So you're coming in along the way, seeing how the project and the project team is performing, and then forming a view as to, well, how are they progressing, and what feedback, what advice do we have for what they can do or need to do to make sure that they're able to hit the project goals by the end of the project. So on one level, we were a very productive team because we wrote and presented our report to the embassy and to the project owner on deadline, right? What was not so visible was that I was the one who gave the presentation. I happened to be the most junior, youngest member of the team. I was the one who gave the presentation because I was literally the last person standing. It had been a highly conflictual team. These 4 people had never met before. We'd been put together by the client. Our team dynamic never really worked well. People were distracted by other assignments. There was tension and different perspectives. And, you know, we kind of gave the presentation, presented our report. And so the agency was able to check a box, midterm evaluation completed. But I'm not sure that our product had much impact because we were trying to inform and influence how this project's going to go forward. And again, I'm not sure that our findings were fully adopted and owned by the client to be able to make changes in how they were proceeding. So, you know, I think that this, you know, part of this thing is this challenge of these external markers can sort of give a false view as to performance and productivity. And so, you know, I'd be very interested to kind of go in and unpack how do we look at how the team is doing?
Yeah.
sort of in parallel, maybe not completely separate, but in parallel from how it's tracking on metrics of progressing along a timeline or steps in a process.
Michael, question to you. Do you think that's linked to the performance of the leader of the team, or do you think it's genuinely, you know, a sort of bottom-up inclusive team thing per se?
I think the team leader definitely has a influence. And these days, so many teams that people are part of are not kind of permanent, fixed, bounded teams. People are moving across multiple teams in the course of their day. Some teams, they're the lead. Other teams, they're a subject matter expert. Other teams, they're an advisor. And so, you know, Amy Edmondson, who's known nowadays a lot around psychological safety, she had written a book some years ago called Teaming. And the idea is that, you know, one way you can do is rather than just focusing on developing a team as an intact team and how they work together, another angle is you help all the members of a group develop the skills of teaming, how they enter and contribute to teams and how they leave, because that's the reality, right? So you don't have time necessarily for team building, team formation, but because everybody knows how to team, the teams have a higher chance of being effective together.
Yeah. Sue, you said something really interesting there, and Michael, your immediate response was equally interesting as I listened to both of you. So you made the point about the media loves the quantitative, you know, they love the soundbite and so on. And Michael, in your immediate response, you said, I've got a story to tell.
Indeed. Yeah.
So with every team, the media love a personal story. If we can put a person around the narrative, or if we can put a narrative around the person, we may have a chance of bypassing a little bit of the hard quantitative and actually bringing forward some of the that qualitative. So here's my question out of that observation from what both of you have said. And Michael, you touched on it then in your last comment. When we now look at teams collectively, but then we need to start looking at the performance stroke productivity of individuals within the teams. How do we balance both of those? And I'm mindful to go back to my original anecdote of that person who spoke least and appeared to have the biggest influence. So how, in your opinion, do we balance those two elements? This thing of the individual's contribution, not necessarily quantitatively, but actually more qualitatively, versus the quantitative against which we are more likely to measure the performance of the overall collective. How do we balance both of those in your views?
That's interesting, Martin, because you know, you're talking there about you know, all sorts of different influences which could affect implementation of a project over time, and how a team or teams in the context, but Michael was making it work together. But I think we've touched on this, but not specifically. I don't think we should forget the human element in contributions to team processes. And you know, your interesting example of the person who has the most influence has potentially the least to say. Now, you know, you start thinking to yourself, well, what sort of personality does that person have then? You know, obviously, I suppose, you know, I have in my mind, it would be a person with quite some gravitas, you know, whatever that means. Maybe they have seniority in terms of age. Maybe they have seniority in terms of perception as to ability to strategize and conceptualize. Maybe they are leaders. You know, maybe they are nominated leaders within the team, or, you know, maybe it's a visitor from the outside. I don't know. You know, a more senior person who's in that meeting for a specific reason. But if you take it that it's someone who's a member of the team and who more or less has some sort of authority, then personality is clearly going to play a role. You know, you could conversely have other people, you know, the other end of the spectrum, who are quiet and you know, are shy, you know, are a little bit shy by nature. So their influence on the meeting may be less. And in that sort of context, you need, we know very well, don't we, as facilitators, you need skilled facilitators or leaders, skilled leaders, to be able to, you know, enable everyone to participate. So the person who hasn't got so much to say but has gravitas has an equal view to the person who hasn't got so much to say equally, but for different reasons. And clearly because, you know, that person perhaps is new, less knowledgeable, has a role which is not central to the discussion that's ongoing, is a bit shy. But, you know, we all bring to meetings our operational, our job description, our tasks on the everyday, which is more the sort of rational, linear. But then around that is clearly our personalities, you know, the human, the non-linear, the complex. I mean, what's more complex than a human personality? And what's even more complex to get so many different, you know, individual human personalities working together. I mean, what a dynamic, what a promising dynamic, what opportunities. You know, and it's that side, I think, which interests me, to very much complement, if not encapsulate the and ultimately become more important than linear, the measurable, the implementable, the operational.
And we have to think about time, Martin and Sue. Sorry to break the good mood of this conversation so far and the food for thought we're sharing here. I think our viewers are delighted, as I am listening here. I got my takeaway with IPO. Love that, Michael. And the teaming skills. This could be an opportunity for facilitators to be hired by big corporations, big organizations, to have a facilitator on duty to avoid the IPO on any meeting, right? The highest paid opinion in a meeting can spoil everything. And for our colleagues, coaches, team coaching could be also mandatory in order to have these sequence. But then over to you, Martin, because you normally summarizes everything so nicely.
Yeah, it's I haven't been able to take notes, but I've been trying to mentally track, I guess, the conversation that we've had so far. We started like our theme of measuring productivity versus performance. And I suppose that's where we separated out the idea of performance versus productivity. And I think it's fair to say that we came to the rough conclusion that productivity is relatively easy because it's quantitative. But performance, while performance can be reflected in the quantitative, it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And because it's not telling us the whole story, that then brought us into the conversation of monitoring or managing performance versus productivity of the collective versus the contribution of individuals to that collective. And I think that was partly, Michael, where you brought in the HIPO or hypo, which I love that particular idea as well. That partly reflected into the anecdote I provided myself of the person who contributes least may, in some instances, actually contribute most when measured from a slightly different perspective. So I guess that then brought us into our conversation about the time frame over which we choose to measure things. So if we're measuring against very short term, and Michael, you gave us the wonderful example of a 3-week piece of work that quantitatively can get measured against a report, a box ticked, but actually under the surface, we might discover not such a well-functioning team, probably not a team that's going to come back together again, probably an investment of time and resource that actually may not have produced nearly as much long-term productivity as we might have reasonably expected. So that concept of if we measure something over a very short time versus over a very long period, how we go about measuring that, we need to be careful about, so that we actually measure, I suppose, the most indicative elements that are going to differentiate between the individual's performance versus the collective team performance. I think it's probably fair to say, in summary of our discussion, it's not as simple as just count the number of widgets that were produced at the end of the production line. When we come to the human person people dynamic, and I think this is a key point, Sue, that you brought out, was we are absolutely people before we are machines. And in being people, measuring what we do, how we do it, and then more importantly, and Sue, I'm now leaning back into something you said, how we do it in conjunction with other people now becomes a really important challenge, so that we then focus on measuring the correct things in the most appropriate way. And it may not always be about quantitative. In fact, it probably won't be always only about quantitative. And we just need to be cautious that we don't measure the wrong thing and end up getting a potentially wrong result.
Absolutely. That's why, dear viewers,
Wonderful.
if you need anything, contact these wonderful meeting doctors we have here with us today. We are here to assist on any matter that you can think about when gathering people, right? Okay, so last piece of takeaway, Sue, Michael, from the conversation, and we close the mic for today.
Yeah, I think for me, this lovely challenging combination of the operational, the rational, the linear, with the human, the complex, and the a little bit ephemeral as well, ephemerality. I mean, gosh, how do you measure that? But what a challenge, what a challenge to bring those together and create team processes, implementation of projects in an optimal way.
Mm-hmm. I'm feeling sort of very animated and warmed up around this topic, because there's a lot you could say. So let me add one different element. The focus on metrics and measuring often assumes, I think, to some extent, that there's a pre-definition of what to monitor.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to be open and curious to what's going to come in from the side that gives you data about what's going on. It may not match to an existing metric you're tracking, but it can be very important of this is what's going on and this is what needs attention.
Absolutely. And that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you so much for taking your time to watching us on a Sunday. Of course, you are also able to watch us throughout the week, as this is going to be on LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much, dear guest speakers, Sue, Michael, and Martin. Amazing summary, even without your notes today. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.